I want to say a very strong thank you, Dankeschön, to Sima for that incredibly moving presentation this morning. My heart was in my throat the entire time you spoke, and you are a woman of great courage, and it was deeply moving, and I want to say that. And I also know that we're in for another very incredible story this afternoon from Jumanda. So this is a really special day, and I'm honored to be here. While we're talking and living through, I've been watching television, as you all have, with the terrorism in Mali, the plane that went down 2 weeks ago, when it was at the terrorism in Paris, the terrorism in Lebanon, and so on. And we are understandably fixated with this in a very profound way. And a number of us who are going to Paris are taking a deep breath because they have canceled the big marches, both the big one on the 29th of November. They were expecting probably 500,000 people. That's been canceled. Apparently, a lot of Europeans are going to go to Berlin now. That's going to be the place where the big march takes place. But there's a nervousness around this, and there's an urgency to, I think, talk about it. But there's also an urgency for us to think about the climate crisis that is upon us and the water crisis that is upon us. And I just want to say that, in fact, the water crisis and the climate crisis is a huge part of all of the other crises that we're hearing about, including the crisis while all of the countries that we're dealing with. In Syria, there was a terrible drought not that many years ago, a few years ago in the north, and there were huge numbers of refugees who had to leave northern Syria, move down to the south, people who were just left without any kind of livelihood. And the government, Assad's government, allowed wealthy friends to come in and take over the land and take up as much water as they wanted to, destroying what was left of a lot of the water source there. And if you go to many situations, crisis, war situations around the world, we will find that water is not, I'm not, of course, suggesting it's the only issue, but it's often one of the issues. When people are denied their fundamental human rights, the breeding ground for great unhappiness takes place, and that's the kind of work that I've been involved in a lot of ways. And I just want to say, you mentioned the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. Our organization turned 30 just a couple of months ago. We had a big annual general meeting to celebrate. We came together to fight the first free trade agreement in the world, which was between Canada and the United States when Ronald Reagan was president, so you can see why we were nervous in Canada. And we've stayed together to fight all the bad effects of economic globalization and to fight for justice. And we're Canada's largest social and environmental justice organization, but we don't have the kind of problems and issues that Sima is talking about. But within our First Nations community, our Indigenous communities, there's a lot of violence, and there is a whole movement around dealing with the fact that murdered and missing Indigenous women don't get reported. The police don't follow up in the same way they do with other women. So this lovely gift was from the Blood Reserve in southern Alberta. It's an incredibly large area of First Nations reserve, and this is the only place in the world where this stone is found, and it was made for me by hand. And it says on the back, murdered and missing Indigenous women. So I wore it today to make a connection with Sima and the work that you're doing for women in a very different part of the world. But in many ways, the issues do resonate wherever we come from. So I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to give you 4 aspects of water that I think we need to be really concerned about, but because this is a project of hope, I'm also going to talk about what we are doing and what people around the world are doing in each of these areas to fix what's wrong. Because I don't want to just tell you the problems, I want to tell you what we can do collectively and what we are doing. The first is potentially the most serious in the sense that it's the ecological crisis. We are a planet running out of clean water, and I know that's really hard to understand when you're here on this beautiful lake and it's raining outside. And I was just outside and there are great big clouds and it's going to rain some more, or perhaps those are snow clouds. I know what snow cloud looks like. I come from Canada, and those look a little like snow clouds to me. So I just want to say to you strongly that we who grew up and live in a place with a lot of water tend to have an image of what I call the myth of abundance. It's a myth that the water can never run out. And in fact, what you need to know is that the lesson we learned when we were little children and is still being taught to children, that there's a finite amount of water in the world and can never go anywhere. It'll always be there. Maybe we can pollute it and we need to stop polluting it, but the actual water will always be there traveling around the hydrologic cycle is not true, okay? This is a lesson that has to be unlearned. We are a planet with a finite amount of water, and the demand for water is going up. If you see the charts, the demand is going straight up and the supply is going straight down. Why are we doing this? Well, we see water as a resource, and the more modern we are, and the more industrial we are, and the more sophisticated we are, and the more urban we are, and the more consumer-oriented we are, the more this is true. We lose connection with water. Water just becomes a resource for our pleasure, our convenience, and our profit. And so we move it where we want it to be rather than leaving it where nature put it, and generally where it should be staying if we are to have a healthy hydrologic cycle. What are we doing? We're damming our rivers to death. Most of the major rivers in the world no longer reach the ocean. We're pulling up groundwater with technology that was only discovered about 65 years ago. So in all the history of humanity, the only groundwater we ever were able to take were from wells. But all of a sudden, in the 1950s, they discovered deep bore well technology that allows people to drill deeply into the ground and pull up ancient aquifer water that is being used up far faster than it can be replenished. We are now doubling our use of groundwater every 20 years. And using new satellite technology, NASA in the United States has recently found a way to map groundwater, the major groundwater sources, and they have just put out a report that says that there are 37 major aquifers in the world, and 21 of them are already in danger. This is after only 60 years of pumping. In fact, they said 8 of them are being sucked dry, and this is the term that they used. And if you go to the report, you can, and we've got this up on our website, you can look at the aquifers in the parts of the world that are in trouble. So we are a planet that is destroying our water heritage very, very quickly. We have a global food market, so when you are growing a commodity that takes a lot of water to produce, and then you're shipping that commodity out of your region, and many poor countries are doing this, desperate for trade, you are also exporting your water. And again, this is part of the issue around the use and abuse of water in some global south countries for the benefit of countries in the global north. And many global north countries bring in what's called their water footprint. Great Britain imports 2/3 of its water footprint. Japan imports 98% of its water footprint. In other words, all the water it needs for its goods and services and just to live is basically imported in food, in clothing, in automobiles and whatever. Computers, it takes a huge amount of water to make computer chips and so on. So we need to understand that we are actually a planet running out, and there was an international study done by the World Bank using scientists from around the world, and they said by 2030, the demand for water in our world is going to outstrip supply by 40%. That means that there will be a 40% greater demand for water than water existing in our world. And I don't know if you have found the secret to finding new water, but no scientist yet has. Desalination is not the answer. It's intense, it's energy intensive, it's very expensive, and it sends back out into the ocean a very polluted brine, salt brine, which now countries that are doing this are building pipelines to send this stuff further and further out into the ocean. So we do not have an answer for what we're going to do if and when we run out. India's in severe trouble. Pakistan's in severe trouble water-wise. China, as you know, produces so many of the goods for the world. Since 1990, it turns out, over half of their rivers have disappeared. They're gone. Nobody knows where they went. They're gone. China is going to run right into a water wall. That's going to be when China stops producing all the running shoes and toys for the world, because they will not have the water. You can go to 22 countries in Africa where desert is growing, where we're creating desert. You can go to the story of the Aral Sea, which was a lake in the former Soviet Union that was once so large they called it a sea. The fourth largest lake in the world is now just a trickle. Lake Chad in Africa, the sixth largest lake in the world once, is now almost gone. And this was not due to climate change as we understand it. In other words, greenhouse gas emission fueled climate change, which of course exists, but this was due to over-extraction. In the case of the Aral Sea, it was for cotton production in the desert and massive destruction of the water system there. And California, you've probably read that California is in crisis. It's not just California. Mexico City is sinking on itself. It's called subsidence. That's when you take out all the water underneath a city or a community, and so the city starts to sink, and the churches are all kind of tipped now. Anywhere you go, including my country, is having some kind of water crisis. But the most important water story in the world is Brazil. And the reason is, until a few years ago, if you asked anyone, any scientist, what is the country that has the most water in the world, it would be Brazil. Always. They never had droughts. They didn't have droughts in recorded history. In the last 10 years, they started getting droughts. In the last 5 years, the droughts became severe. In the last 3 years, the rain stopped in Sao Paulo. Now, Sao Paulo is a city in the south of Brazil with 20 million people. And suddenly they are out of water. Why are they out of water? It isn't climate change as we understand climate change. It's two things. One is that they're pumping up their groundwater really quickly to produce sugarcane ethanol, which they're exporting all over the world. And biofuels are bad. Biofuels use too much water, way too much water. That's what's killing the Ogallala aquifer in the United States. That once the biggest aquifer in the world, it will be gone, says the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in our lifetime, because they have 200,000 bore wells pumping this thing mercilessly to create corn ethanol for export. Okay, so we are talking about major water systems that we can see diminishing. Back to Brazil, the other issue is that they've cut down 2 massive Amazon rainforests. And what we know now is that rainforests and vegetation generally create a healthy local hydrologic cycle. A rainforest gives off an enormous amount of moisture, twice as much moisture as an ordinary forest. And then this moisture is carried as rain on air currents that they call flying rivers. And these flying rivers take the rain thousands of kilometers away down to Sao Paulo, and like a gift twice a year, they get as much rain as they could ever need, and it fills all the reservoirs. It's gone. And I've been in Sao Paulo, and I've been to communities where you only get water between 5 and 6 in the morning, when you turn on your tap and you get a little bit of a dribble. Maybe clean, it may not be. And then 10 to 11 at night, and that's the only water you get, and otherwise you have no water. So we have a crisis here, and it stuns me that we continue to have political contests like the presidency of the United States, or we just had an election in our country in which no one talks about water. It's the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, and it is going to hit us. When it hits very hard, and it hits the poor first, which is the next thing I want to talk about, but hope. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to restore watersheds. We need to stop destroying water in the first place. We need to leave water where nature put it. We need to govern on a watershed basis, which is basically what you've done here that helped restore Lake Constance. Excuse me, I was here 10 years ago, I think now, for a project, the water. Yes, thank you. I'll get my water. You know what it is? It's that I'm from Canada, and it's too hot in here. Seriously, it's too warm in here. How are you guys all sitting there with sweaters on? I'm dying. All right, now I'm good. So Lake Constance, excuse me, is a perfect example of communities and countries coming together and saying that we're going to clean. See, look, everybody's taking your jackets off. One more sip of water. Doesn't matter. We'll share the germs. Germs are healthy. So restoration, reclaiming, reclaiming, this will go away in a second. This is too many planes. Which water will I take? This one. Exactly the same. All right. We have Lake Constance is a perfect example of a community that's come together to fix what was broken and to bring a not living lake back to life. And I don't think most Europeans know this, but we use you as an example because in the year 2000, the European Union brought into effect a watershed agreement whereby all waters, be they rivers, lakes, or aquifers that cross a boundary, must be governed on a watershed basis. And you guys are actually the first and the best. You actually brought in legislation that we use and we tout around the world. There's a man named Rajendra Singh who works and lives in Rajasthan, India. He was working with communities that had no water, and he went back to very ancient techniques where they build small berms and dams and build plant the kind of plants and trees that bring back water. And he has put in 2 million wells into communities and greened the desert. And Rajendra says he loves this because he keeps getting arrested by the Indian government because he brings water to places that have been dry for decades. And then they say, well, that's our water and we're going to charge you for it. And he says, no, the villagers brought this water back. That's our water. You go away. So he says he loves getting arrested because he always gets to take on the government. We have a brand new agreement in the north of Canada between a number of territories, First Nations, and provinces, where for the first time ecosystem protection is put at the very heart of this treaty to protect a whole watershed. And this is the model that a lot of us have been talking about. When countries make an agreement around water, usually it's, I want this share and I want that share, and everybody's fighting for more. But if you can say what's the best for the watershed, what's the best for protecting the aquatic life around the watershed, then you come at it in a very different way. One of my favorite stories is from Southern Australia. Australia is a very dry country, and they have basically one water source called the Murray-Darling. And the Murray-Darling runs into the ocean in South Australia. They had a severe drought that sort of ended, but not quite. It's coming back, I think. But they had a severe drought several years ago, and the Murray-Darling stopped reaching the ocean. So there are 2 cities there. One is Adelaide, and one is Salisbury. Adelaide decided to put in a huge desalination plant, which, as I said, is expensive and energy-intensive, very, very bad technology. Salisbury decided to see if they could do something different, and they decided to gather all the rainwater, all the sewage water, all the storm water, and put it together in huge wetlands and huge lagoons where they planted the kinds of plants and put the kinds of aquatic life that actually eat pollution. And they have greened the desert. There are birds that have come back. It's just a magic place to visit. This is a miracle of a story, and people come from all over the world who live in desert communities to learn how they did this. And Salisbury is now selling water back to Adelaide because Adelaide's desalination plant isn't working, and actually they've sued the desalination plant, which is lovely. The great romantic poet Gerard Manley Hopkins talked about how nature, there's a deep dearness down in nature, and that nature will recover if we just give nature a chance. I attended a wonderful event at a university in Boston not long ago, Tufts University, from a lot of scientists who've been working on the science of greenhouse gas emissions and this percentage and that percentage, who said, while we're working on that, can we start thinking about how to renew our soils, how to renew our wetlands? And there was one wonderful story after another about local communities renewing water retentive landscapes, renewing rivers and lakes that were dying. So this is really important that we understand that we are a planet running out of clean water, and that we have to balance it by having a new reverence for our water. And we've lost that connection in most of our lives. Not First Nations people, not Indigenous people, but most of us have lost that connection. So that's the first crisis. The second crisis is that we have a human rights crisis. around water. And this is where nearly 1 billion people in the world do not have access to clean water, and 2.5 billion people do not have access to sanitation. In fact, 1 billion people in the world defecate in the open every day. I've been to the slums in Kibera in Kenya, and they have what they call flying toilets, and you defecate into a plastic bag and then you throw the plastic bag because you cannot afford to use the toilets such as they are, because you have to pay local thugs, entrepreneurs, money to be able to use these pits. So people just use plastic bags and throw them. And I always say to my environmental friends who don't look at the human rights issue, well, if you care just about the environment, then you better care about human rights, because how are you ever going to keep a river clean when 1 million people are dumping their sewage right into the river? And I say conversely to my friends who are working on human rights but not the environment, how are people to be able to care about the environment if they don't have these fundamental rights and needs taken care of in the first place? So it's really important that we're building a movement that takes the analysis and the work that these two separate spheres are working on and putting them together. It's very important that we recognize, however, that the lack of access to water is not just in the global south. Through austerity measures here in Europe, thousands of people have had their water cut off in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, in Hungary. It's a story that's gone untold. I tell it in my new book, Blue Future, because I think we need to understand that globalization has brought many good things to the world. This is globalization right here, me speaking to you, and Jumanda and Sima and coming, and our friend from Syria. This is the part of globalization that's good. But economic globalization has promoted macroeconomic policies that basically serve the 1%. And by the way, last month was the date when, for the first time, the top 1% in the world own 50% of the wealth. If there's not something profoundly wrong with our world, that statistic should say it. In the year 2000, there were 111 billionaires. This year there are 111 billionaires in 2000. This year there are 1,865 billionaires in the world. So we are seeing a growing gap, not only between parts of the world, between rich and poor parts of the world, but we're seeing a growing gap between rich and poor within our countries, and this is happening everywhere. So we now have a global south right here in the global north, and we have a global north in the global south, in that there's a very wealthy elite that actually buys into all of these policies, unregulated trade and unlimited growth and privatization and deregulation of environmental and health care and so on, and buy into it in a way that sells out their own people. And I think of them as being a kind of global royalty who have more in common with one another than they do with their own people. So the global south is here. I will tell you a story about Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, Michigan was once a thriving, wealthy city right on the Great Lakes, right on Lake Michigan. Very beautiful old buildings. If you ever get a chance to visit it, you'll see once it was a city with a lot of money. But under this North American Free Trade Agreement, the auto industry was able to just go south and move their plants to Mexico, where the wages were so low and where the environmental laws, well, pretty good on the books, were never obeyed. And there was just a dramatic gutting and a dramatic unemployment, growth in unemployment. 1 million people moved out of inner city Detroit. They call it white flight, and left behind African Americans, very poor, unemployed, and then they turned around and doubled and then tripled the water rate, because they said we don't have the tax base because all these people moved out to provide water. 2 years ago, they declared the city bankrupt, and they brought in a manager. This is the governor of Michigan, brought in a manager. This is what's happening to cities around the world, by the way, when they go bankrupt because we don't put money into social services and infrastructure. And this is a story in many, many, many first world cities. So they brought in this manager who said, okay, I want to privatize the water service. And you can imagine a big company getting the water service in Detroit for fire sale price, right? And then they have a water service on the Great Lakes. I mean, it would be a plum for some corporation. Veolia or Suez from France likely would be the companies. And then they said, but we want to get rid of the debt. And so we're going to turn off the water to all the people who are not paying their water bill. And the poor who can't pay their water bill started getting their water cut off. They announced they were going to cut off 3,000 families a week. This was a year and a half ago. And I went down to Detroit and we held a big summit. And I was so upset, I called the UN, I called my friend who was the special rapporteur on water and sanitation, and she came to Detroit. She brought the special rapporteur on housing, the special rapporteur on food, and they did an analysis and an examination of the situation. They held a press conference and they said the United States is violating the human right to water. So this is really important that we understand, and we did get a moratorium for a while. This is very important for us to know that the perfect storm of declining water sources, growing gap between rich and poor, and privatization of water services is going to mean that more and more people in the global south and the global north don't have water. The good news on this is that we really pushed hard to get the United Nations to recognize the human right to water and sanitation. And you could say, well, that's just such a motherhood. How could, I mean, of course, water is a human right. And I will tell you, we were fighting Canada, my country, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, a whole bunch of southern countries that were dependent on aid from these countries also said, okay, we'll oppose it. We were fighting the World Bank because the World Bank promotes privatization of water services in the global south. We were opposed by all the big water companies like Nestle's bottled water and Suez and Veolia and all these big players, the big food players. And we didn't think we were going to get it, but I had the honor of being invited to be the advisor to the 63rd President of the General Assembly at the UN. And we worked together with a man named Pablo Solno, who was the ambassador from Bolivia to the UN. And we just did it. We just put the resolution to the United Nations General Assembly, and it came to a vote. It was very controversial. If you can believe it, it was controversial. Came to a vote on July 28th, 2010. I was there in the balcony with my staff who were crying because we were sure we were going to lose the vote. And I was sure too. And I said, look, it's an honor to be here. It's so moving that we're here. And, you know, but we'll be back in 5 years. Don't worry, we'll get this. It takes time, because they were young and they just had this feeling that it'd never happen. And I, being a little older, I know things take time, right? So, well, I was wrong. When they vote, they sit at their desk and they vote electronically, and it goes onto a huge electronic screen. 122 countries voted in favor of the human rights to water and sanitation. Not one country opposed it. 41 abstained, which means they didn't have the courage to oppose it, even though they did oppose it, you know. And I'll never forget that they turned, Pablo Solno, the ambassador from Bolivia, was up in the balcony with me and our gang, and he was just standing there smiling with his arms crossed, right? And one after another, the countries that were angry with him were turning to him like this and saying, how dare you make us make a choice? We weren't ready. This is terrible. You know, and Pablo Solno stood there with this big grin on his face, saying, you could see him thinking, and what part of I won and you didn't, do you not understand? Because here's the thing that's important, whether they supported it or not, and by the way, now all the countries of the UN have adopted this, but whether they supported it or not, if you are a member state of the UN and the UN adopts a new right, you are obliged to adopt it too, and you're obliged to promote it. And there are 3 obligations for the rights to water and sanitation. Governments have the right to have an obligation to come up with a plan to fulfill this. So for governments that don't have the funding to provide water for their people, wealthier countries are supposed to help. They're also not allowed to, the obligation to respect, so you're not allowed to take away a right. So if you are if you're turning somebody's tap off, and try to imagine, it's 6 o'clock in the morning in Detroit, Michigan, and you and your kids and your mom and everybody sound asleep, and these trucks drive up, and these big guys, they're not the public water workers, they're private, it's a private company, and these guys are big and tough. And they come in with no warning, and they cut the water off to the entire block. No water. No water for flushing your toilet, no water for drinking water, no water to wash your dishes, no water to shower, no water to cook, no water for your children. And it takes months to, even if you have the money, it takes months to get the water back. And if you have young children, these water workers are followed by social workers who come in and take your children away, because you're not allowed to be raising children in a house without running water. So try to imagine what we're dealing with, okay? So we were, the notion that you know, you can take this away. This is one of the obligations on government that's no longer permitted. The third obligation, and this is really an exciting one and we should be using, is that all governments have the right to protect local drinking water from destruction by third parties, like fracking, like mining, like pulp and paper, whatever the industry is that might be destroying your water. And we're working with communities in Latin America where Canadian mining companies are in there doing terrible things, destroying their water, hurting people's health, and we're using the human right to water and the government's obligations not to let this happen as our weapon. So we're very excited about it. And when you hear Jamanda speak this afternoon, you'll hear that one of the very first court case that we had after the UN adopted the human right to water was the San people of the Kalahari, who used the actual language of what happened at the UN to regain their human right to water and have their water bore well in the desert reopened. So this has been a very, very exciting project for us. There's a huge amount to do, trust me, but a number of countries have opened their constitutions to amend them to recognize the human right to water, including Mexico. You could have knocked me over because we have so many concerns with human rights in Mexico, but it was a sustained fight by a wonderful local set of lobby groups, a coalition of human rights groups. So very, very exciting, and there are many, many cases that give us great hope there. The third concern that we have around water now then is an issue around who controls water. And this is a very important question, because if there was tons of water, if there was all the water we all were taught there was, there wouldn't be a problem. But in a world where the demand is going up and the supply is going down, a long time ago, the private sector, some people in the private sector, realized that whoever controls the world's water is going to be rich and powerful. And so we have been struggling to have water protected as what we call a commons and a public trust, which means that water belongs to the people, it belongs to the ecosystem, it belongs to future generations, and governments hold it in trust and protect it in trust. And so we demand that there be a hierarchy of access, like who gets to access water, not a company that's going to pollute, not a company that's going to destroy water or overuse it. We have to have very strict rules about who has access to water. So we've been battling privatization of water in a bunch of ways. The most sort of obvious is the privatization of services. That's water services and wastewater services. About 25% of all your water services in Europe are privatized. So it's higher than in North America. In North America, it's only about 5%. In the global south, it depends on where you're talking about. But the first water privatization came under Margaret Thatcher in 1987. She privatized everything, and she sold the entire water concession, not just the running of the water, but she basically said to Thames Water, you own it. And how the people in Great Britain continue to allow Thames Water to run their water system is beyond me. The statistics are stunning, how high the rates went right away after it was privatized, and then they've just kept going up steadily, steadily, steadily. It's a huge fight for poor people to be able to afford water, and now they're having the same fight in Ireland. Thames Water dumps their pollution in the Thames River, and they pay no taxes every single year. It's a big story on the front page of their papers that this company finds ways to get away around taxes. So that set the tone, and then the World Bank started saying to countries in the global south, if you want water services, if you want money for water services, you have to privatize, and you have to take, basically, we're going to pick the company for you, and that'll be it. One of the first of these was in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Cochabamba, or Bolivia, is a small, landlocked, beautiful, absolutely beautiful country in South America. And the people are about 85% indigenous. They've kept their own dress, their own culture, their own music. They're deeply proud of who they are. But they're poor, compared to the wealth that we have. So the World Bank said to Cochabamba, which is both a province and a city, if you want water, if you want us to help you, you have to bring in a private company. So they brought in a company called Bechtel, which is a big American engineering company. And the first thing Bechtel did was triple the price of water, so people couldn't afford it. The next thing they did was they said, we own the rain. And so if you're catching water in a rain barrel or anywhere, any way to catch it for your use, we're going to send inspectors around, and we're going to take that rain, and we're going to make you pay for that rain. So there was a war that people took to the streets, led by a shoemaker named Oscar Oliveira, who became a kind of international hero. Oscar stood up to bullets. They brought the army in. This was before the current government, which is much better government. And people were killed. It was a real water war. And then they elected Evo Morales president, and he told the company to go away. He told the World Bank to go away. He kicked out Suez from La Paz, which was another private company in the capital. And he paid a price for it because they sued him. These companies have tremendous amount of power. But it's a wonderful story because then that led Uruguay to become the first country in the world to declare water a human right, even before the UN did, and then that started a trigger of countries fighting back. And just now, since the year 2000, in the last 15 years, 235 municipalities around the world who tried privatization have gone back to a public system. And this includes big cities like Berlin and Paris. 40 cities in France alone said no to privatization and have gone back to a public system. So we're really excited about the fact that we just put this huge fight globally. We call ourselves a water justice movement or water warriors. We said no to privatization of water services, that the profit motive has no place in the delivery of water. It's a fundamental human right. But they're pushing really hard in China. They're pushing really hard in India. And I can tell you there are parts of the world now where local governments working with private companies are actually denying limited water sources to their villages, to their people, to small farmers, and diverting that water to free trade zones, to industrial zones, because they want to become modern and they want an industrial model like that of the global north. And so we are literally seeing communities going without water. So the good news is that the remunicipalization, we're also working with something called Blue Communities. And I'd love for Bregenz to become the first blue community in Austria. A blue community is where a municipality declares that water is a human right and a public trust and says we will not allow our water to be privatized. It also asks us to start moving away from bottled water and promoting public water, which is a little more delicate in Europe because you guys drink a lot of bottled water, right? There's quite a big movement in North America against bottled water, but here I know it's just harder here because it's just so much part of the culture. And I have no problem with sparkling water in glass. It's the little plastic bottles of water. If you put all the little plastic bottles of water in the world that we drank last year, the collectively humanity, end to end, just water, just those little bottles, they would reach to the moon and back 75 times. When you think about the plastic in the ocean, And those gyres of plastic that we know are in all of the aquatic life in the ocean. I'm not saying it's only bottled water, but you can't turn on the tap and get coffee. You can turn on the tap and get clean, good water. At least here you can. And I think we have the right to demand that everywhere people have the right to water. In this state in Karnataka in India, this is one of the states that has made a decision to take their limited water resources and put it into these free trade zones. They actually shut off all the public water sources at the request of the private company. So people are forced to buy either private water if they can't afford the rates for the public water delivered privately, or they buy bottled water. And one of the people, I don't dislike anybody very much except one person whose name is Peter Brabeck. And Peter Brabeck used to be an ice cream salesman in Switzerland, and then he rose up through the ranks of Nestle, and now he's the CEO. And he has said that there is no such thing as the human right to water. He gives in now and says, oh, okay, maybe 1.5 of the world's water should go to the poor, and the rest of it should be put on the open market for sale, right? He's all heart. He advises the World Bank on water policy in the Global South. So he advises the World Bank to advise and enforce privatization in poor countries, and then he turns around and he sells his Pure Life bottled water to the people who can't afford the rates that come with privatization. I mean, there's a special place for him somewhere. I don't know. I think I'm just going to put him in a room and talk to him for a long time. Maybe that would be the punishment that he needs. But Blue Communities is a way for our municipality, or we now have universities. Bern, Switzerland became the first non-Canadian, because we've got a bunch of them in Canada, the first non-Canadian city to become a Blue community. But their major church became a Blue church, and their union became a Blue union, and their university became a Blue university. So it's a way of saying we love water, we respect water, we want to think about water. We don't want to wait till, like the people in Sao Paulo, till the water doesn't come out of our tap. We want, and even if it does still come out of our tap, we care about it in other places. So the fourth thing that we should be concerned about in terms of water, and then I'll stop talking and we can talk together, is free trade, so-called free trade. My organization came into effect to fight the first free trade agreement in the world that then morphed into NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with the United States and Mexico. Well, we've been living with free trade with the United States for 25 years, and we have a lot to share with you about what that feels like. And it isn't pretty. I love Americans. They're wonderful. I worked lots in the United States, and it's the same thing. It's not the people, it's the governments and the corporations. But really, you're dealing with the most powerful corporations in the world, and they are relentless in going after what they want, which is lower standards, bring the standards down to their level. And this is going to be a big issue for people in Europe with your higher food safety standards and your higher standards on animal rights and welfare. You have higher environmental standards, higher labor standards, higher human rights standards. These are all standards and regulations that these companies will want to use. TTIP, the European-US agreement, and CETA, the Canadian agreement between Canada and Europe. They're going to want to use these agreements to force these standards down. They don't want to bump into higher standards or different standards when they cross borders, and they want the lowest level playing field possible. As Christian said, that we're under ISDS, this right for foreign investors to sue the government of another country. We're facing $4.75 billion worth of challenges, including challenges against a moratorium on fracking, including one where the company was successful. We banned the export of PCB toxics. You would think that's a good thing to do, right? Not allowed to do that. You had to pay the company compensation. So this same type of model that we've been living with for 25 years is what you're going to live with if we don't stop TTIP and CETA. And this is how I first got into water, because I was reading that first free trade agreement, and I noted that it described water as a tradable good, water in all its forms, including ice and snow. And I thought, how could water be a tradable good? I don't understand. And that set me on this journey to try to figure out the politics of who is making the decision in our world around water. And then I started to realize there was this ecological crisis, there was this human rights crisis, and there was this corporate grab, and that we had to do something. We had to build a movement to take care of it. Now, how do these trade agreements threaten water? Very specifically, they threaten any legislation, new legislation, or changed current legislation that in any way, so that you might bring in to protect water, that in any way affects the right of foreign investors to make money. So I'll give you an example. In our country, we have this tar sands. Christian talked about the tar sands in Alberta. They've taken down a boreal forest the size of Greece. It looks like a moonscape. It's just awful. And so they're mining this bitumen. And it's thick, tarry stuff. It's the oil mixed in with sand, and it's called bitumen. And to get the oil out, they have to take an enormous amount of water and steam blast the oil to the top, and then they take it off. And the water, the poison water, is held in huge, huge lagoons. The second largest dam in the world, just next to the Three Gorges, is the Syncrude site in Alberta. And this water is so poisonous that they shoot. They have the sound of guns shooting every couple of seconds, because if the birds land, they just die en masse, right? This is what we're producing, and oh, by the way, we want to sell it to you. And that's already something that the European Union has backed off on in terms of a regulation. They were going to give that energy source from the tar sands a lower grade under something called the Fuel Quality Directive, and under protest from the Canadian government, the European Union backed off and said, no, okay, we won't give it a lesser grade, even though it destroys our water. So here's the trade issue. If the government of Alberta or the government of Canada were suddenly to say, you absolutely have to stop destroying so much water, you have to reclaim, you have to use half as much, whatever, they would all have to do it. But the foreign companies, the American oil companies protected by NAFTA, would have the right to sue for billions of dollars of compensation. This is what you need to understand. These are the new rules coming in. Similarly, if you have privatized your water services, you can't go back, because the private water companies can say, when we came in here, you allowed a for-profit system for water delivery, and you can't go back now. We're not allowing you to do that. You would have to pay us money. It even goes so far, and we have a case where an American company operating a pulp and paper company or plant in one of our provinces left the province. Nobody kicked them out. They turned around and they sued for the water rights they left behind. The government of that province said, that's our water. You were allowed to use it when you were here, right? But creating jobs, but you left. We don't own you that water. So they launched an ISDS challenge under NAFTA, an investor state challenge, and won $130 million, about 95 million euros, which is just outrageous, and sets a precedent where a corporation from one country operating in another country can claim to own the resources, which is a new frontier in corporate ownership. So we are really fighting back, and there's been a huge movement, as you know, about TTIP in Europe. There is a petition that had 3 million signatures. There are groups all over Europe, anti-TTIP, and we keep saying, don't forget the Canadian agreement, CETA, because here's the thing, CETA is done. CETA is finished, and it has the ISDS, the investor state that everybody hates. It has that provision in it. And so if for some reason you're able to stop TTIP or hold it back for a few years or radically change it or take the investor state provision out of it, American companies can still go through Canada and sue through CETA, because all the American companies have subsidiaries in Canada. So what I guess I want to say here, and then I'm going to end, is that the macroeconomic policies that our governments are promoting make it very difficult to do what we need to be doing to protect water, to protect nature, to protect human rights. I had the odd distinction of debating Chancellor Angela Merkel in the spring, because when Germany hosts the G7 or the G8, whatever, maybe G8 again now that everybody's friends with Russia, when they host the G7, they agree that the Chancellor and her advisors will spend some time with civil society. I was invited to be one of the debaters, or debate. They called it discussion, but it was debate. And she was saying, oh, they care about empowerment of women and the growing difference between rich and poor and the climate change, and she was going on. And my argument was, that's all very well. And it's good that you're going to talk about that when you get together. And she was talking about the SDGs, the development goals at the UN, which were just being developed then. But I said, all your macroeconomic policies, deregulation of the financial markets, and the deregulation of the environment, which is happening right now in Europe. Under Juncker, you need to know this. You need to be following this. In the name of cutting red tape, they are slashing a lot of your environmental protections in Europe that you fought very hard for. And I have found most Europeans don't know this is happening. And just 2 weeks ago, the European Union dropped its intention to ban 31 chemicals because the U.S. doesn't ban them, and the U.S. Trade people were saying, oh, this isn't a friendly thing to do while we're having these discussions on TTIP, right? So we don't want you to do that. So it's very important that you know that that's happening. So, and free trade, these agreements, including one that's coming along on services, all of these make it so that corporations have more power to deny governments the right to protect their environment, protect their water, protect their social services, protect their people, protect the human rights of their people. And so it's really important that while we're fighting for these fundamental human rights, we understand that these macroeconomic and development policies are working against us. And it is my strong belief that you cannot be economically and politically literate if you're not trade literate, if you don't know and understand these trade agreements. So I have, and it's available through our friends here, a report that I wrote in German called, very exciting title, CETA, TTIP, ISDS, Lessons from Canada, but it will tell you what we've lived with through here. But it is a threat, not just to water, but to all of the public services. So I'm going to end, because I know now this is time for us to start to have a conversation. What we need in the world, we need many things, but around this issue, we need what I call a new water ethic. And the new water ethic is this. We have to ask with every single policy, and listen, I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning. We're a planet running out of water. You must believe me. I can show you study after study after study. I am on a dozen listservs that every day bring me another horror story. We are a planet in trouble, water-wise, and it's going to get worse, and we have to take action, and there are things to do. There really are things to do, but we have to be conscious of it. And that means, and that part of that is in Paris, a number of us are going to be saying, you've got to look at water. The way we abuse water is one of the causes of climate change. It's not just that water's a victim of climate change. The way we abuse water is a cause of climate change. And the way we can restore watersheds and restore lands that have been destroyed, bring back healthy local hydrologic cycles, is one of the solutions to the climate change crisis. And that's going to be a message a number of us are taking into Paris. So becoming conscious of this, and all policy, all practices should be judged by how they impact water. How we grow our food, we need to grow our food sustainably and locally. We need to have policy that promotes local sustainable food production. These trade agreements go in the opposite direction. How we produce energy, what's its impact on water? I'm telling you, if we looked at that, most of our energy sources would be not acceptable. We would have to move to a set of alternatives. And they're there. We know they're there. And we know that there are places that are moving towards really good alternative energy sources that don't kill water. And this water ethic needs to take into account basically 4 principles, and I'll just end with these. Water is a human right. My fear is that as the world runs out more and as the gap between rich and poor grows, the race that many of us are in to ensure clean, safe, accessible water for everybody could be lost. Not because there aren't good intentions, but just because that perfect storm of lowering, declining water stocks and growing inequality and growing water rates is just a recipe for disaster. So all government policy that plans for water, all policy at the UN that plans for water must put the vulnerable, the most vulnerable, at the very center of all policy and all plans. That water is a public trust. I said this before, but it's really important to remember that water doesn't belong to anybody. It must not be allowed to be appropriated for human profit, for private profit. It must be considered a commons, a fiercely protected commons that belongs to not just us, belongs to the ecosystem, it belongs to other species, and it belongs to the future. Future generations have just as much right to breathe clean air and drink clean water as we do. We have to recognize that water has rights, that rivers have a right to flow, that species have a right to exist and evolve, and that we need to adapt our laws, our human laws, to nature in a very different way. Mostly now, nature is seen as property in most Western law. That's just clear. But we're seeing a number of court cases around the world, including one recently in India, where they actually established that the river has rights. But think of what it would be like in a major disaster like the disaster in the Gulf of Mexico with BP. What if the fish could sue? What if we could conceive of thinking of how the ecosystem could fight back, or how we could fight back on behalf of ecosystem. And finally, and I'll just leave the formal part with you, I think that we need to understand or adopt the principle that water can teach us how to live together. And by that I mean in a world where the demand is growing straight up and the supply is going straight down. It's a recipe for violence. It's a recipe for conflict. We're already seeing water used as a weapon of war. Syria is a perfect example where the government's turning off water to people. If you want to hurt people, just turn off their water supply. But it is entirely possible, this is my dream, that water can be something very different. And that water can be an avenue of peace, and water can be nature's gift to us to teach us how to live more lightly on the planet and how to live differently with one another. My grandfather was taught to hate your grandfather, and my father was taught to hate your father, and I'm supposed to hate you. But wait a minute, our river here is dying. Our water system is dying, and it doesn't really matter which of us wins because we're not going to make it unless we turn to this. And I can tell you of places and projects where they agreed, don't talk religion, don't talk history, don't talk politics. Let's just come together and see if we can find a way to share and save this precious water source. So my dream is that water will become nature's gift to us, and that we can walk forward in a path of justice and sustainability and equality, understanding that water is a language we all speak. Last story, I said to Oscar Oliveira, the leader of the fight in Cochabamba, why water? Why did you, because I said, you guys have had everything taken away from you. You know, this is colonialism. They came and took all your best minerals. They ran your energy systems. They privatized your energy in Bolivia. Why did you stand up for water? And he said, because, Maude, I would rather see my child die of a bullet than waterborne disease. It's life and death. We're talking life and death here. It doesn't feel like it living on Lake Constance, but we are. This is a life and death issue around the world, and it is a wonderful opportunity for us to come together, to put other differences aside, and find our full and shared humanity. Thank you so much.